Hello, everyone, and welcome to Understanding the New FDA Guidance on Data Standards, presented by Roe. I'm Rebecca Friend, the publisher of the Fierce Marketplace Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Rob Wilson, Chief Strategist at Biostatistics and Data Standards for Regulatory Submissions at Roe, and Ben Vaughn, Senior Statistical Scientist at Roe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. I've got just a few technical notes for you before we begin. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of the presentation. And we're going to be following the presentation with a Q&A session, so please submit your questions during or after the presentations using the Q&A box at the right side of your window. And I think we're now ready to begin. Rob, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This webinar will cover topics related to recently released FDA guidance documents on standardized study data and electronic submissions of data to the FDA. We will discuss the following. First, some background and context related to these documents. Secondly, document content, including the relationship of the documents to one another, the purpose of each document, what submissions are covered, and also what submissions are not covered, how the guidance and requirements will be implemented going forward, when the requirements take effect, and we'll provide a couple of different scenarios and a couple of examples. We will then cover some details related to the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, and finally, we will end with what these guidance documents mean for those of us in industry and those of us preparing for or in the process of submitting data to the FDA. First, we'll highlight a few of the key milestones related to providing submissions to the FDA in electronic format, as well as providing standardized study data. We've shown three of the more substantial ones here. First, in 1999, the FDA began accepting electronic submissions as we currently think of them via the eNDA guidance document that was issued. In 2003, the eCTD guidance was issued, and this formalized the structure of electronic submissions and made a requirement for, and was actually made a requirement for electronic submissions in 2008. CDER began accepting SDTM data format in 2004. However, up until what we're going to talk about today, the FDA had not previously made this a formal requirement. We provide a little more detailed context on this slide, and I should note this is taken from a presentation given by Ron Fitzmartin at the Computational Science Symposium. He, of course, works at the FDA, and we think this provides a nice outline of how we've gotten to where we are today, particularly at the end of 2014. Let me highlight a couple of these items. First, as I mentioned before, in 2004, the FDA announces its support for CDIS submissions, in particular SDTM. Jumping ahead to 2012, the FDASIA Act, the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, was signed into law, which authorized the submission of standardized study data. FDASIA included the reauthorization of PDUFA, and one of the stated goals in PDUFA is to improve the efficiency of human drug review through, and I emphasize this word, required electronic submissions and standardization of electronic drug application data. Also in 2012, draft guidance on standardized study data was released, the purpose of which was to promote the use of data standards in the electronic submission of study data to the FDA. In 2013, the FDA released a rather short position statement endorsing the use of CDISC standards. And finally, not shown here, but bringing us to today, are draft and final guidances related to electronic submissions and standardized study data. I'll spend the rest of my time in this talk talking about those documents. As I mentioned, in 2012, FDASIA was signed into law. It included the reauthorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA, and one of the stated goals of PDUFA 5 was to improve the efficiency of human drug review through required electronic submissions and standardization of electronic drug application data. In addition, Section 745A, which is shown here on this slide, which was added by Section 1136 of FDASIA, requires that submissions be submitted in electronic format. The agency concluded and noted in several different places that it's not feasible to describe and implement the electronic formats that would apply to all submissions covered by Section 745A in one guidance. The agency has and presumably will release multiple documents to describe the electronic formats. In February 2014, the FDA released several draft documents for public comment. Two of these were guidances, and one was a technical data guide, which was incorporated by reference. All of these were related to the format of electronic submissions. In particular, these included the following documents. First, guidance on providing regulatory submissions in electronic format, which really was an umbrella document for the subsequent documents that I'll describe next. A guidance on standardized study data, and finally, incorporated by reference, a study data technical conformance guide. In December 2014, the agency released updated documents based on public and industry comments, and these are final versions. Two of these three documents are considered binding and contain words such as must and required, and these are all throughout the document. An overall outline of these three documents is as follows. The first document, formally entitled Providing Regulatory Submissions in Electronic Format, Submissions under Section 745A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, describes how the FDA interprets and plans to implement the requirements of 745A. Essentially, the document provides a roadmap for how and when requirements will be implemented, how requirements will be communicated, and submissions impacted by the guidances. Again, this document can be viewed as an umbrella document and an overall roadmap for other more focused guidance documents, including the guidance on standardized study data. Note that this document is binding. The second document that I just referenced, formally entitled Providing Regulatory Submissions in Electronic Format Standardized Study Data, is the first of what will presumably be several individual guidances that will be developed to specify formats for specific submissions and timetables for implementation. This document and the referenced Study Technical Data Guide document describe the requirements for an electronic submission of standardized clinical and non-clinical data. Following the path outlined in the umbrella document, this document describes how and when data standards requirements will be implemented, how they'll be communicated, and the submissions impacted by the guidances. As I mentioned, this incorporates by reference the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. Like the first document, the umbrella document, this document is also binding. The third document, the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, provides specifications, recommendations, and general considerations on how to submit standardized data using FDA-supported standards that are located, as most of us know, in the FDA's Data Standards Catalog found on its webpage. Incorporated into the standardized study data document, this document is incorporated into the standardized study data document mentioned previously. Unlike the other documents, which are binding final guidances, this is intended to be a living document, and it covers a number of topics. I'll highlight just a few here. These will be discussed in more detail by Ben shortly. First, provide some details on how to provide an overall study data standardization plan, study data reviewers guides, and other documents. Second, it describes exchange formats accepted by the agency. Third, describes clinical and non-clinical data submission formats. Fourth, therapeutic area standards, which are in development. Fifth, the use of controlled terminology and vocabularies for clinical data. Sixth, recommendations on submitting data using the ECTD format. And finally, data validation and traceability rules and guidance. Which submissions must be submitted electronically under this umbrella document? Generally speaking, the following submission types are included, and this is rather broad. Certain, if not most, investigational new drug applications, abbreviated new drug applications, and certain biologics license applications. Specific submissions are not included. So this guidance is not applicable to devices that are regulated by CBER as biological products under 351 of the Public Health Service Act. Generally, those are devices used for screening donated blood for transfusion transmissible diseases. Also not included are submissions under Section 561 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and those generally relate to expanded access and other investigational products. Exemptions include non-commercial INDs and others that may be discussed in individual guidances. So how will the agency implement specific electronic submission requirements? The general process is as follows, and these are shown in the various dots along this timeline here. First, we'll start with the green dot. Individual draft guidances will be developed to specify the electronic formats, the subject matter, and the scope for submissions under 745A. These draft guidances will be posted at various places on the FDA's website. The agency will publish a notice in the Federal Register announcing the availability, and there will be a comment period, shown in the red dot. Next, we'll move into the finalization period and the final guidance posting. So once the agency has completed its review, including incorporating comments, there will be a notice in the Federal Register announcing the availability on the FDA website of the final guidance. Dates will be provided when certain formats will be required. These, again, will be identified in the guidance document. Subsequent revisions will be announced on the FDA's website and published in the Federal Register. Now, when will electronic submissions be required? Lastly, moving here to the orange dot. Generally speaking, electronic submissions are required no earlier than 24 months after a final guidance is issued. The required formats for the specific submissions and corresponding timetables for implementation will be specified in the individual documents. When will revisions, again, not a new requirement, but when will a revision or an update to an existing format take effect? And generally, these are on a shorter timetable than the 24-month time period I just talked about. What's mentioned is a 12 or 18-month time period. In this document, the FDA outlines a few very clear examples on how and when certain standards will take effect. And I will just walk through one of them briefly. And this is the first example provided, the one with the 24-month implementation period. So let's say the FDA issues a draft guidance specifying new formats for electronic submission. They publish the Federal Register notice and the availability of the draft guidance. After the comment period, a final guidance is produced and posted. The final guidance provides that the specified format will be required 24 months after the date of publication. After the 24-month implementation period is passed, the guidance will have a binding effect, as I've mentioned before. It will have a binding effect. Again, there are other similar examples that I suggest you read in the document that clearly outline when standards and formats will take effect. So briefly, a summary of the overall umbrella document guidance. As I mentioned, this is an overarching document that will serve to provide the process and outline for future, more specific guidance documents. This is a binding guidance, unlike most guidances released by the FDA. Since this is a binding guidance, failure to follow the technical conformance rules can result in a refusal to file. Generally speaking, our recommendation is that this guidance and subsequent technical guidances should be assumed to apply to all submissions to CDER and CBER. Next, I'll move on to the second, more specific guidance document released by the FDA. It specifically is related to the submission of standardized study data. This document is a reflection, it is an application of the process described in the umbrella document, specifically to standardized clinical and non-clinical study data. This is described in the first highlighted section on the slide. It outlines requirements for submitting standardized study data. The requirements that must be followed for electronic submission of standardized data are generally those that are a format that the agency can process, review, and archive. The agency can process, review, and archive electronic submissions of clinical and non-clinical data that use the standards specified in the data standards catalog described earlier that is available on the FDA's website. So which submissions must follow a standardized data format? This is a very similar list to what was provided in the umbrella document. They will be required for the following submission types: certain INDs, new drug applications, abbreviated new drug applications, and certain BLAs. Note that this requirement includes all subsequent submissions, including amendments, supplements, and reports to one of the submission types I just described and are shown on the slide. So even if the initial application was not submitted electronically, for example, the amendment should be. What types of submissions are exempted from the electronic submission requirement for standardized study data? Again, this is generally the same list as described in the umbrella document. It's not applicable to those devices that are regulated as biologic products under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act. In addition, non-commercial INDs, expanded access INDs, and other similar ideas. So what are the requirements that must be followed for electronic submission of standardized study data? The Data Standards Catalog provides a list of currently supported and or currently required standards. It includes quite a bit of other information, including the date the FDA will begin to support a particular standard, the date the support ends, etc. And I advise everyone, if you aren't familiar with this spreadsheet that's posted to the FDA website, you do. There is a lot of pertinent information there. Of note, the agency may refuse to file NDAs and BLAs that do not have study data in conformance to the required standards specified in this catalog. So what are some of those format categories? In general, there are a handful of buckets here. First, we'll talk about exchange format standards. And some examples of those noted are PDF format, SAS transport file format, or XPT, and extensible markup language, XML. Some of the noted study data standards that are supported are, in particular, those endorsed and created by CDISC, including the Study Data Tabulation Model, SDTM, SEND for non-clinical data, and for analysis data, the Analysis Data Model, or ADAM. Finally, controlled terminology standards. First, I want to note that the FDA notes in the document that sponsor custom terms are not considered controlled terminologies. This is something we come across quite frequently. But instead, they're talking about formalized controlled terminology standards, including National Drug File, CDISC controlled terminology, MEDRA, and others. Will the FDA issue waivers of the electronic submission requirements for standardized study data? In general, as I mentioned before and repeated throughout the document, electronic submissions of study data must be in a format that the FDA can review, process, and archive. And this really is driven by the study data standards catalog posted to the FDA's website. The FDA will not provide waivers to submit data that do not conform to any FDA-supported study data standards. However, sponsors or applicants may apply for a waiver from the requirement to use specific versions. There are detailed instructions in the guidance on how to apply for a waiver, and of course, the FDA encourages sponsors to request this as early as possible. So the big question for everyone is, when will electronic submissions of standardized data be required? There are a couple of terminology-related points I'd like to hit here. For the purposes of this guidance, the study start date for clinical studies is the earliest date of informed consent among any subject in the study. And the FDA gives a specific example of where to find that, for example, in the SDTM trial summary domain. And I suggest it's actually located a footnote. I suggest you look here. Look in that footnote. For non-clinical studies, the study start date is the date on which the study protocol or plan is approved. In other words, the study initiation date. So that's study start date. The other point I wanted to make was related to transition date, a term that's used frequently throughout the guidance document. The transition date is the next calendar March 15th date, and I will note it's always the next calendar March 15th date following the publication of a Federal Register notice. The transition date indicates the beginning date of the implementation period, which will be consistent with the timetable set forth in the implementation guidance, in other words, the umbrella document. So this is the time at which the clock starts. So the clock starts not on the date on which the final guidance is posted or an update to a format is posted, but instead the clock starts at the transition date. Again, the next calendar, March 15th, following the publication of a Federal Register notice. Let's walk through three categories of requirement implementation, and these are all described in the guidance document. Two of them are shown here on the slide. This first one is not shown, but I think is rather self-explanatory. The first is the initial timetable for implementation of electronic submission requirements. In other words, when are we required to submit data in a standardized format after the December 2014 final guidance documents were posted? And as stated in the umbrella document, all studies with a start date 24 months after the publication of the document must use the appropriate FDA-supported standards, formats, and terminologies. So the guidance document walks through a rather clear example, and I'll step through it very briefly. So let's say FDA publishes its final guidance document December 2014, which in fact it did. For studies with a start date after December of 2016, sponsors must use the appropriate FDA-supported standards specified in the catalog for NDAs, ANDAs, and certain BLA submissions. The catalog will list, again, on that spreadsheet I referenced earlier, December 2016 as the date the requirement begins. Let me go through two examples that are shown now on the slide. For a new standard, and that's defined in the guidance as one that has not previously been supported by the FDA, and it's not listed in the catalog. New standards will be required in submissions for studies that start 24 months, or in some cases 36 months, after the publication of the Notice of Availability in the Federal Register. Again, the timetable here will start 24 or 36 months after the transition date. Finally, let me go to the third bucket, which are version updates to FDA-supported standards. So version updates may include content or structural changes, and the example given are new SDTM domains or variables, and two, errors, fixing errors, correcting other items, clarifications, etc. Stated in the guidance is that the 24 and 36-month initial implementation timetables will no longer be required in this particular setting. Instead, a 12-month timetable will be set. Again, this is a not earlier than 12-month timetable will be set from the point where the Federal Net Register is posted and the transition date is announced. Again, this will be no earlier than 12 months after the transition date. Discussions about non-clinical study data, standardization plans may be initiated at the pre-IND stage and should continue throughout development. This is something, obviously, the FDA encourages and Roe has a particular amount of experience with, and we encourage this as well. Initial discussions should take place as early as possible, but technical questions should be sent to the FDA, in particular to technical support teams identified in each center, for example, the eData group in CEDAR, on an ongoing basis. Formal meetings are not required. For implementation support, FDA suggests referencing the study data technical conformance guide, which Ben will talk about in just a moment. Again, this is a living document, will continue to evolve. In addition, they suggest separate Type C meetings if needed. So in summary, the e-study data guidance that I just described is the first guidance document under the umbrella document that I described initially in this discussion. It is a binding guidance and can lead to refusal to file if rules laid out are not followed. Generally, we recommend that submissions to CDER and CBER are assumed to fall under this guidance. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk in some detail about the study data technical conformance guide in an outline for how those of us in industry can prepare for and should be prepared for the implementation of the rules laid out in these guidance documents.
Okay, so the first thing to note here is that this is non-binding. We fully expect this to be a living document and for FDA to update it with some frequency, or at least we hope so. There are very specific things in here and things that could change over time as FDA starts getting submissions and starts seeing what people are turning in and some deficiencies or some things that could be done better. This is also a draft guidance. The other two were final documents. And we expect this to never be final simply because it's a lot easier to update a draft guidance. And so as new things come in and they start seeing what people do, this will change. So here we have the table of contents on this. I am not going to go through everything in here, but you can see there's a lot of detail detail that we don't have time to go into because UNC Louisville is playing at 2 o'clock, and that's way more interesting than this. But this document is very helpful. It has a lot of the specific things where you're preparing a submission and you need to know what can I do, what can't I do, what is FDA expecting to see. And some examples of this, and you can probably see some of these things on the table of contents, file size. The FDA has a limit of 1 gigabyte on the size of SAS transport files that you can put in. If you go over that, you need to split it up. And generally, FDA wants you to split it up by the subjects on the subject ID so that a particular subject has all their data in one data set. But then there's one example of where you would not do that, an exception to that rather, would be the lab data. And there, FDA expects you to split the lab data based on chemistry, hematology, urinalysis, and if that doesn't get down small enough, split by the actual panels. And those sorts of things are in this guidance document, which is very useful in addressing these very, very specific issues. But again, it's draft because some of these things could change. The reviewers could find that some of these suggestions are causing headaches or they would like things to be done better. However, this last guidance contains 3 requested documents which are worth some additional thought, and we're going to speak about a little bit more here. The first is the Study Data Standardization Plan. Then there's the Study Data Reviewer Guide, and finally, the Analysis Study Data Reviewer's Guide. Now, FDA provides all these recommendations. They acknowledge that there's variability in implementation. You can deviate at your own risk, but by providing these documents to FDA, you can really communicate what it is that you're sending to them, where they can find things, and why you made some of the decisions and how you have implemented these guides. So first, with the Study Data Standardization Plan, we think that this is going to be probably the most important document to prepare as part of implementing data standards over the next 5 years. And what goes in here is the list of planned studies, types of studies, study designs, planned data standards, and a list of justifications for studies that do not conform to these data standards. And why we think this is going to be so important over the next 5 years is that as these requirements become binding, and you have studies that are done under data standards, and then older studies, legacy studies that were not done under this, it's going to be a little difficult for FDA to know what they're working with, and you really need to communicate to them what you're sending them. You're going to have a mix. You're going to have to make some judgment calls, and sometimes you will submit legacy data, but then when you're putting together an ISS, ISC, you're going to pull that together into an AM format, and FDA really needs to see how your traceability works and how you plan to integrate these various data sets, and this guide really lays out your plan for that. The next document is the Study Data Reviewer Guide, and this is at a study level. So for each study, you would have the protocol, the title, the number, the version, what its design is, what standards you're using in there, what formats, terminology, description of the study data sets, and what data standards that you use. And if you have to deviate from them, here's where you communicate what those deviations are, why you did it, and some issues that might pop out. So if FDA ran OpenCDISC on your data sets that you submitted, they saw some things. Here's where you would address why they're seeing those things. And really, I would absolutely endorse running OpenCDISC yourself because we know that FDA is doing this. Go through that report. Anything that pops out there, I would include just a justification or address it. And a lot of those things on there are ignorable. If you have missing dates, often I'll pop out in there, and it's just a one line to acknowledge that this is real live clinical trial data. It's expected to have some things that don't work perfectly. OpenCDISC will pop out some of these things as errata, and they're pretty easy to address. But if you have larger structural issues, there should be good justification for that, and this is where you communicate those justifications. And again, knowing that FDA does realize that there are limitations to some of these data standards. A perfect example for ATOM is if you want to do a correlation analysis, ADAM is not structured for that. It's very vertical, whereas in order to do correlation analysis, you have to have things structured in a horizontal manner so that you have very different outcomes on a single record, and that is not ADAM compliant. So this is where you'd describe that sort of thing. The last document is the Analysis Study Data Reviewer's Guide. And this is what used to be known as the README. And this is really to orient the reviewer as to how to do the analyses. And this can repeat a lot of data or information that can be found in other places, such as the protocol, the SAP, and some of these other documents. But this is the first point of contact for for a reviewer who's actually doing analyses. So if they want to do your primary efficacy analysis, which data sets should they pull? Are there any flags on there, subsets, that sort of thing? How are they going to get to your analyses? And this is really an orientation document. And again, this last document, the Analysis Study Data Reviewer's Guide, really does follow the idea of the README from before. And in their footnotes in this particular guidance, FDA does reference the FUSE website, where there's a template for the Study Data Reviewer's Guide. And I would certainly go over and check that out. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, so just use that template. And that is something that probably would be updated if there is some feedback from FDA. So do keep your eyes on the FUSE website for anything where they might change that based on feedback that sponsors have gotten from FDA. This document is FDA's strongest endorsement yet of SDTM and ADAM. The 2013 statement absolutely endorsed CDISC standards, but it was, as Rob mentioned, it was very brief, and it alluded to some guidances that would be coming, and these are those guidances. However, this is a very formal endorsement. This is the de facto standard at this point for what FDA is looking for data standards for anything coming in after we hit the timelines that Rob described. So in conclusion, the most important thing is to go out and read the guidances. There is a lot of helpful information in there, and we're not suggesting that you memorize it, but anytime you have a question, go back to the guidances and look what's in there. FDA has been very helpful in providing a lot more information than was out there previously, and so these documents are really there to help you. Start a conversation with the FDA as soon as possible, very early. They know that everyone's going to be dealing with a mix of data, and you're going to have a lot of legacy data, and so just talking to them early on about what you have and what you plan to do will be very helpful. FDA absolutely can request data from protocols that are already complete and do not fall under the binding guidances to be converted to these data standards. And by having this open communication early and really working with them, you can avoid a situation where FDA comes back and demands the data standards. As long as you have really laid out for them and they understand what you have and why you have it, that can be avoided. Also important is to really ramp up your education to make sure anyone who is working with your plans for data as it moves from CRF to submission, that they really know these guidances and you don't get any surprises. But finally, we really want to emphasize the importance of collaboration and not confrontation. You really want to be working with the FDA, communicate as much as possible and as early as possible to what your plans are, because too many sponsors really go into it with a confrontation with what they want to do without really looking for FDA feedback. And the ideal here is that you are really working with them to make their jobs easier. And if you're doing that and making their jobs easier, it will certainly work out much better for the submission as a whole. We really do expect over the next 5 years to see a lot of work in terms of working with legacy data, working with FDA, really helping them understand what it is that you're doing and what you're sending in. After that period, you should be doing data standards on pretty much everything, and it'll smooth out a lot. But during that transition, it's going to be a little bit trickier. So at this time, I'll hand it back to Rebecca to take any questions.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Great presentations from both of you. All right, so we're going to move on to the Q&A section right now. So here's one question for you, and either of you feel free to answer this one. Should CDISC standards be followed for phase 2 protocols at this time?
I would say that you certainly should be thinking about doing that. It's going to be a large cost, and in doing this, well, not a large cost, but there is a cost associated with it. And it's a little tricky knowing where that inflection point is, because no one really wants to invest in something if they don't know the drug works. But knowing that this is on the horizon and that you really, at this point, it's very likely that you will be after that date for making these required for your phase 3s, it really would make a submission a lot easier if the phase 2s are done in STTM and ATOM following these data standards. And there's some work that you can do to make this a little bit easier by pushing a lot of the work back into actually your CRFs by following the CDASH standards. That makes the conversion to STTM and then on to ATOM a lot simpler and a little bit cheaper.
Okay, great. And here's another question for you. Could you please provide clarification on transition date one more time?
Rob?
The transition date will always be March 15th of the calendar year after the posting of a new format or an update to an existing format. The transition date is the date on which the 745A clock starts. So if, for example, we're operating under a 24-month timetable for a new standard, that 24-month clock will start on the transition date, which will be, again, the upcoming March 15th of the calendar year after the posting of the final guidance or update to an existing guidance or format, for example. Again, this is the date on which the clock starts.
So, for example, the guidances that went out in December would hit that transition date this year, March 2015, and then the 24 months from then?
The one exception to that rule are the new guidances. So there are specific language in there related to the new guidances. The initial implementation is 24 months after the posting of these guidances. So December 2016 really is our key date for these first release of the guidances. Upcoming new formats will use this transition date for when the clock starts.
Okay, great. And here's another one for you. I have an upcoming submission. Should I convert non-CDISC data to CDISC?
If it was collected in legacy format, and this means anything that's not CDISC, and your clinical study report was, and all the tabulations and all the data sets associated with that, if that clinical study report was based off that legacy data, I would say have a conversation with FDA. We are absolutely seeing FDA request that things are done in CDISC format. On the other hand, you're breaking the clear traceability by doing this conversion. So if you convert the legacy format, you're going to have to provide some documentation as to what you did and in terms of bringing that legacy data up to CDISC, and that traceability is going to be a lot more difficult. But on the other hand, you don't want to end up where FDA, you submit and then FDA comes back and requests it. And literally while Rob was talking, I got an email asking for ATOM data on something that was submitted, a phase 1 that was submitted in a legacy format. So again, it's pretty hard to say exactly where to make that transition. And I would say open a conversation with FDA, but traceability is valued over everything else. So if you do that conversion, make sure that you have a lot of information about how they can maintain that traceability, so they can take any number in your CSR, find it in a TLF, find it in the analysis data set, find it in your tabulation data.
Great. Well, I think that that's all of the time that we have for today. With a lot of really great questions, and if we did not get back to you, we can get back to you individually after the webinar. I want to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Live webinar. I also want to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page that you used to register for the event. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.